All right, buckle up, everyone, because we are diving headfirst into the political storm just 9 days out from the 2024 election.
Oh yeah, things are definitely heating up.
And to kick things off, we're dissecting a speech, a fiery one, might I add, by none other than former President Trump.
A real barn burner.
You could say that. He took the stage at, where else, but a jam-packed Madison Square Garden. And let me tell you, it was classic Trump. Bold claims,
Oh yeah, the signature attack.
all the fireworks you'd expect.
It's fascinating how he uses these big rallies, these almost spectacle-like events to really connect with his base.
Right. So let's get into it. What's the core message Trump's hammering home here?
Well, in a nutshell, he's arguing that America's in deep trouble, real trouble.
Like teetering on the edge.
Basically, and he's saying that only HE, and I emphasize the he, can pull it back from the brink. You can practically hear the Make America Great Again chants echoing in the background.
Oh, they're definitely there. So he's painting a pretty dire picture of what's going on in the country right now.
Oh, yeah, a very bleak picture, especially if Kamala Harris wins. We're talking economic collapse, crime running rampant,
Like a dystopian future type of vibe?
Kind of, yeah. He even throws out the possibility of, get this, World War III.
Wow, okay, that escalated quickly. But is he just speaking in generalities? Or does he get into specifics?
Oh, no, he gets very specific. Like
Yeah.
on immigration, for example, he uses incredibly strong language. Claims America is practically occupied by illegal immigrants, that
Mhm.
Harris has basically allowed criminals and gangs to invade the country.
Whoa, that's some loaded language right there.
It is, and then he goes on to share these tragic stories of Americans who were killed by illegal immigrants, really hitting that emotional nerve.
Playing on people's fears.
Exactly. Classic fear as a motivator. He wants voters to feel like they're facing this huge crisis, this turning point where they need to choose the strong leader.
But the question is he presenting an accurate picture of the situation?
Right, and that's a question you should always ask yourself when listening to any political speech. What are the facts behind these claims? We'll definitely dig into that more deeply later on.
Okay, so we've got fear of economic collapse, fear of unchecked immigration, and fear of, well, a potential world war. Anything else he throws into the mix?
Oh yeah, he goes even further. He brings up the possibility of a military draft if Harris wins.
Oh, wow. Now he's playing on every parent's worst nightmare.
It's a potent image for sure, a direct appeal to that deep-seated fear for your children's safety, but it also makes you think about the broader impact of this kind of rhetoric.
Like how it affects the way we talk about politics.
Exactly. Does it actually encourage violence or make it impossible to have reasonable discussions? These are things we really need to consider.
Because it definitely feels like his approach is all about dividing people.
Oh, absolutely. It's that us versus them narrative all the way. You're either a patriot who supports him or you're the enemy.
And the enemy could be anyone, it sounds like.
Pretty much. Democrats, the media, even some Republicans who don't totally agree with him.
He's really drawing a line in the sand there.
He is. It's a way to solidify his base, making them feel like they're part of this exclusive group that's fighting against a common enemy. But long term, is that healthy for a democracy? What happens when we can't even agree on basic facts because we see each other as the enemy?
Big questions.
Yeah.
For sure. So he's laying out this really dark vision of what could happen if he doesn't win. But does he offer any solutions, aside from just himself as the answer?
He does, yeah. He lays out some specific policies, things like massive tax cuts, bringing manufacturing jobs back, making America energy independent, stuff that sounds pretty appealing, right?
Definitely appealing on the surface, but haven't we heard this before?
You're right. There are a lot of echoes of his 2016 campaign promises here, that same language of economic revival.
So is it just a rehashing of the old playbook, or is there something new here?
It's hard to say for sure, but the world has changed since 2016. The global landscape is different. The economic challenges are more complex. So we have to ask, are these promises still realistic in 2024?
And what could the unintended consequences be if he actually tries to implement them this time around?
Right. Those are the kind of questions we'll be exploring as we go deeper.
Okay, so besides the economic stuff, does he touch on any other hot-button issues?
Oh, absolutely. Illegal immigration is a big one. He promises to end it, finish that border wall, all that. He even vows to personally prevent World War III.
Wow, talk about some big promises. He really doesn't shy away from anything, does he?
Nope, it's classic Trump, that mix of grandiosity and, really simple solutions for really complex problems.
But we can't just take those statements at face value.
No, we have to dig deeper. What would actually implementing these policies look like? How would they affect our relationships with other countries? These are things you really have to think about before casting your vote.
Okay, so we've got the doom and gloom predictions, the big promises. Anything else we should be listening for in this speech?
Oh, definitely. We can't forget the attacks, especially those directed at Kamala Harris.
Yeah, how does he go after her?
He doesn't hold back, calls her incompetent, a radical left Marxist, even suggests she has a low IQ.
Ouch, those are some pretty harsh words.
They are, and it's a clear attempt to discredit her, to paint her as unfit for the job. He's trying to make her seem weak, untrustworthy.
But does that kind of attack really persuade anyone? Or does it just alienate people who are already skeptical of him?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Does this approach actually win him votes, or does it just further divide us?
It's something to think about for sure. So he questions her intelligence, her competence, anything else.
Oh, yeah, she goes even further. He claims that if she's elected, she'll lead us straight into World War III.
Okay, that seems like a bit of a stretch, even for Trump.
It does, right. But again, it's about instilling fear, portraying her as reckless and dangerous.
And it raises questions about the role of these kind of personal attacks in political discourse.
Right. Are they ever effective? Do they just distract us from talking about actual policy? These are important things to consider as we analyze this speech and the broader political landscape.
It definitely feels like things are getting more and more heated as we get closer to Election Day.
Oh, absolutely. And this speech is a prime example of that.
So stay tuned. We're going to unpack even more from this speech as we continue our deep dive, including that whole migrant invasion rhetoric, which is
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
definitely a lot to dig into there.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's dig into one of the most attention-grabbing parts of this speech, that whole migrant invasion idea that Trump keeps bringing up.
Yeah, the way he uses that phrase, it's almost like he's describing a war zone.
He really leans into it, even goes so far as to call America an occupied country.
It's powerful language, definitely meant to trigger a sense of crisis, like the country's under attack.
Like we're being overtaken by an outside force.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because it reminds me of other times in history when we've seen similar language used, like during the Red Scare or even the War on Terror, those moments when fear of an other was used to justify pretty drastic policies.
So he's tapping into that same kind of fear, that sense of us versus them.
I think so. And he doesn't just talk about it in general terms either. He uses some really harsh words to describe these migrants, criminals, bloodthirsty. It's really dehumanizing.
It's definitely strong stuff. And then he shows this graphic video montage of violence and crime,
Yeah.
directly linking it to immigration.
Yeah, I saw that. It was pretty intense, a lot of disturbing imagery.
So he's not just talking about it, he's showing it, really trying to get that visceral reaction from the audience.
Right, he's playing on those primal fears, the idea of your home being invaded, your safety being threatened, and it's effective because it bypasses logic and goes straight for that gut reaction.
Especially when you connect it to something as personal
Yeah.
as your family's safety.
Exactly, and he does that a lot in this speech, talking about how these migrants are a danger to American families.
Yeah, like when he talks about those Venezuelan gangs, the Tren de Aragua, taking over apartment complexes, unleashing this violent killing spree across America. It's scary stuff, for sure.
It is, but it also makes you wonder, is this the whole picture? Are these isolated incidents being blown out of proportion to create this larger narrative of fear and chaos?
That's a good question, because he doesn't really provide a lot of context or statistics to back up these claims.
No, and that's something you always have to be careful of with this kind of rhetoric. Are we getting all the facts? Or are we just getting a carefully curated selection of information designed to elicit a specific emotional response?
Right, because he puts the blame squarely on Kamala Harris's shoulders, claiming she's personally responsible for bringing these so-called dangerous criminals into the country.
It's that classic scapegoating tactic, find a single person to blame for a complex problem. It gives people a target for their anger, makes it easier to process all this fear and uncertainty.
And then there's this claim that 325,000 children have gone missing after crossing the border, which is a horrifying thought if it's true.
Oh, yeah, that one really gets to you, but this is where fact-checking becomes absolutely crucial.
Because it's easy to get swept up in the emotion of it all.
Right, especially when we're talking about something as sensitive as children's safety. But we have to take a step back and ask, what are the sources for this claim? Has it been verified by reputable organizations?
Because there's a big difference between anecdotal evidence and actual data.
Exactly, and we have to be careful not to fall for emotionally manipulative language or shocking headlines without digging deeper.
So he's painted this really frightening picture of what's happening at the border, But what's his solution? What does he actually propose doing about it?
Well, he promises that if he's elected, this migrant invasion will end immediately, like overnight.
Okay, but how? What's his plan?
He talks about the largest deportation program in American history, locking up these vicious criminals, that kind of strongman approach.
So, a lot of tough talk. But is that even feasible? I mean, mass deportations would be incredibly difficult and costly, not to mention legally and ethically questionable.
You're right. There are a lot of practical and moral considerations that he doesn't really address, but it's that language of swift, decisive action that appeals to people who are frustrated with the way things are.
People want a quick fix.
They do, and he's tapping into that, promising to cut through the red tape and restore order, that whole drain the swamp mentality.
And to really drive the point home, he even talks about using the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to target these migrant gangs, which is a pretty obscure law, right?
Yeah, most people probably haven't heard of it, but it's basically a law that was passed during a time of war with France that gives the president broad powers to detain or deport non-citizens who are deemed a threat to national security.
So is he suggesting that we're at war with these migrants?
It's certainly a provocative way to frame the issue, and it's likely meant to create that sense of urgency, justify those calls for extreme measures.
Like he's saying we need to take drastic action to protect the country.
Right, but it's a very controversial law, and using it in this context would raise serious questions about civil liberties and due process.
Yeah, it definitely sets off some alarm bells. And of course, he couldn't leave out the border wall.
Of course not. The wall is almost like his signature issue at this point.
It's become a symbol, hasn't it?
Absolutely. For his supporters, it represents strength, security, taking control of the border. For his critics, it's seen as wasteful, ineffective, a symbol of xenophobia.
But is a physical wall really the answer in today's world? We've got drones, sophisticated surveillance technology. Is a wall really the most effective way to manage migration in the 21st century?
That's a debate that goes way beyond this speech, and there are valid points to be made on both sides, but I think it's important to remember that framing complex issues as simple black and white choices rarely does them justice.
Right. There's always more to the story than what fits on a bumper sticker or a campaign slogan.
Absolutely, and we have to be willing to engage with those complexities if we want to find real solutions.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Trump's rhetoric on immigration, but let's shift gears a bit and focus on his attacks on Kamala Harris personally. He gets pretty brutal at times.
Oh, yeah, he really goes after her, questions her intelligence, her competence, calls her grossly incompetent, a low IQ individual, just throws out these insults.
It's definitely a deliberate strategy to undermine her credibility, make her seem unfit for the job.
Absolutely. He even mocks her speaking style, saying no one respects her. He's trying to paint her as weak, unlikable, someone you can't trust to lead.
But does that really work? I mean, does that kind of name-calling actually persuade anyone?
It's hard to say for sure. Some people might find it entertaining, others might be turned off by it, but it definitely contributes to this overall tone of aggression and division.
And he also throws out those labels we've heard before, radical left Marxist, claiming she's destroyed everything in her path.
Yeah, those labels are meant to trigger a negative reaction, evoke fear and distrust. He's trying to paint her as an extremist who's outside the mainstream.
So it's not just about attacking her personally. It's about associating her with these broader ideologies that he wants to demonize.
Exactly. And he does the same thing when he talks about the radical left machine that he claims is controlling the Democratic Party.
He really goes all in on that, calls them vicious, crooked, says they're doing such harm to our country, really amps up the rhetoric.
It's that classic us versus them tactic again. You create a common enemy to unite your supporters and justify your attacks.
And he uses this really loaded phrase, the enemy within, which is kind of chilling, right?
It is. It creates this sense of paranoia, like there are these hidden forces working to undermine the country from the inside. It plays into these anxieties about social and political change, fuels distrust and suspicion.
So we've got fear of immigrants, fear of the radical left, the enemy within. It's a lot of fear-mongering going on here.
It is, and it's effective because fear is such a powerful motivator. But it's important to remember that fear can also be used to manipulate and control, so we have to be critical thinkers, question what we're hearing, and demand evidence to support these claims.
Okay, so he spent a lot of time painting this really dark picture of the state of America. But does he offer any kind of positive vision? What does he actually want to do if he's elected?
He does touch on that, usually framing it in contrast to the negative picture he's painted of his opponents, talking about restoring America's promise, making America great again, those familiar slogans.
But what do those slogans actually mean in concrete terms?
Right, that's where the details get a bit fuzzy. He does offer some specifics, things like cutting taxes, ending inflation, bringing back manufacturing jobs, making America energy independent, all things that sound good in theory.
It's familiar territory, a lot of echoes of his 2016 campaign.
Exactly, and it plays into that sense of nostalgia, that longing for a simpler time when America was supposedly stronger and more prosperous. And that message really resonates with some people, especially those who feel like they've been left behind by economic and social changes.
He also talks a lot about law and order, promising to be tough on crime, give law enforcement more support and resources.
That's a message that appeals to people who are concerned about rising crime rates, who feel like their communities are becoming less safe, and it plays into this idea that he's the strong leader who can restore order.
And then there's this wild idea of building a massive defense shield over the country, a beautiful dome to protect us from external threats, which I have to admit, I didn't see that one coming.
Yeah, that was a bit out of left field, but it speaks to that desire for security, this longing for protection from the chaos and uncertainty of the world, and that resonates with a lot of people, even if the idea itself seems pretty far-fetched.
So we've got a dome over America, mass deportations, a border wall, a crackdown on crime. It's a pretty dramatic vision.
It is, and it's definitely a vision that emphasizes strength, security, a return to traditional values. But it's important to think critically about these proposals. Ask ourselves, are they realistic? What are the potential consequences? Do they actually address the root causes of these complex problems?
Because it's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric, the emotional appeals.
Right, but we have to remember that governing is about more than just making big promises or striking fear into people's hearts. It's about finding practical solutions that work for everyone.
Okay, so besides all that, does he get into any other specific policy areas?
He does. He touches on education, for example, talks about restoring patriotic education in schools, banning critical race theory, what he calls transgender insanity.
So wading into the culture wars a bit.
Definitely, and that's a way to appeal to a certain segment of the electorate, those who feel threatened by social and cultural changes, who see these issues as an attack on their values and way of life.
It feels very divisive, intentionally stoking those anxieties.
It is, and it's effective in mobilizing his base. But it's also important to remember that these issues are complex and nuanced, and framing them as simple good versus evil battles doesn't really get us anywhere.
Right, it just shuts down conversation and makes it harder to find common ground.
Exactly, and we need more dialogue, not less, if we want to address these challenges effectively.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the overall takeaway? What does this speech tell us about Trump's strategy going into the final days of the campaign?
Well, I think it's clear that he's doubling down on the tactics that have worked for him in the past, appealing to fear, anger, nostalgia, those strong emotions that can really motivate people, especially in a close election.
He's definitely not trying to win over any undecided voters with this speech.
No, this is all about firing up his base, getting them energized and out to vote, and, it might just work.
It's a strategy that's worked before.
It has, and we'll have to wait and see if it's enough to get him back into the White House.
Yeah. All right, so that's a wrap on this part of our deep dive into Trump's Madison Square Garden rally speech. But we're not done yet.
I know, we've got more to unpack.
Stay tuned, because next, we're going to analyze those moments where Trump tries to soften his image. Those attempts to appear more relatable and human.
Yeah, the jokes, the anecdotes about his family, that whole thing.
It's an interesting contrast to the rest of the speech, so we'll dig into that and a lot more when we come back. So it feels like he's really pushing that with us or against us kind of mentality, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that can be dangerous because it shuts down any chance for debate or compromise.
Makes it seem like there's no middle ground.
Exactly. And when people start feeling like their entire identity is tied to a political leader or a movement, it can lead to some pretty scary stuff.
Like increased intolerance and violence.
Exactly. History has shown us that time and time again, so it's something we need to be very mindful of.
For sure. So we've talked a lot about the fear-mongering, the attacks, the divisive rhetoric, but there are also these moments in the speech where Trump tries to soften his image a bit, make himself seem more relatable.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Like he throws in a few jokes here and there, tells some anecdotes about his family, tries to show a more personal side.
It's kind of like he's trying to remind people that he's not just this larger-than-life figure, that he's a regular guy who understands their struggles.
Exactly. He wants to come across as someone who's in touch with everyday Americans, someone they can relate to.
And for some people, that probably works,
Oh,
right?
yeah. Those personal touches can be really effective, especially for his base. It reinforces that sense of loyalty, that feeling that he's one of them, fighting for them.
He also makes a point of highlighting the support he has from various groups, mentioning union workers, veterans, even claims to have the endorsement of the Border Patrol.
Right. Those endorsements are important because they lend credibility. He's trying to show that he has broad appeal, that he's not just the candidate for a small segment of the population.
Like he's trying to build this big tent coalition.
Exactly. And by showcasing support from groups that are traditionally associated with different political parties, he's also trying to present himself as a unifier, someone who can bridge the divides in American society.
But is that really possible? I mean, can you really bring together such a diverse group of people under one political banner, especially in today's climate?
It's a tall order for sure, and America has always been a pluralistic society, but that diversity is also what makes us strong, and I think finding ways to celebrate that diversity while also finding common ground is the key to moving forward.
It's definitely a balancing act, and one that we haven't quite figured out yet.
No, but I think it's a conversation we need to keep having. How do we embrace our differences while also working together towards a common goal?
Right, because at the end of the day, we're all Americans, regardless of our political beliefs.
Exactly, and I think finding ways to remind ourselves of that shared identity is more important now than ever.
Okay, so another thing that stood out to me in this speech was how much Trump focused on New York City, talking about making it safe and strong and beautiful and affordable and vibrant again, which is kind of interesting considering he hasn't exactly been popular here in the past.
Yeah, it's a strategic choice for sure. New York City is a Democratic stronghold, so he's not likely to win a lot of votes here. But by focusing on the city's challenges, particularly crime and affordability, he's trying to tap into that sense of nostalgia that a lot of New Yorkers feel for a perceived better past.
Like he's saying, I remember when New York was great, and I can make it great again.
Exactly, and he even talks about working with the mayor and the governor, despite their political differences, to make New York great, which is a message of unity and collaboration that we don't often hear from him.
Yeah, it's a bit of a departure from his usual us versus them rhetoric.
It is, and it suggests that he's recognizing the need to appeal to a broader audience, even in places where he's not traditionally popular.
So maybe he's trying to soften his image a bit, broaden his appeal.
Possibly, or maybe it's just a calculated move to try and win over some undecided voters in a key state. It's hard to say for sure.
Right, because even though he's talking about unity and collaboration, he ends the speech with this really fiery call to action, urging his supporters to fight, 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 and to never surrender.
Yeah, that's classic Trump. He can't resist ending on a note of conflict and confrontation. It's like it's in his DNA.
So after taking this deep dive into Trump's Madison Square Garden speech, what's the takeaway? What does it tell us about the state of American politics in 2024?
Well, I think it shows us that we're still a deeply divided nation, grappling with a lot of anxieties about the future, and that political discourse is often driven more by emotion than reason.
Yeah, we see that a lot. Fear and anger are powerful motivators,
Mm.
and they can be easily exploited for political gain.
Absolutely, and I think this speech is a reminder that we need to be critical consumers of information, fact check what we're hearing, engage in respectful dialogue even when we disagree, and try to see through the emotional appeals and the divisive rhetoric to get to the heart of the issues.
Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together, and we need to find ways to work together to address the challenges we face as a nation.
I couldn't agree more. Our democracy depends on it.
Well said. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, and I think we've all learned a lot about Trump's strategy going into the final days of the campaign.
Yeah, it's been enlightening, and I think it's given us a lot to think about as we head towards Election Day.
Definitely. And we want to hear from you, our listeners. What stood out to you the most in this speech? Share your thoughts with us on social media using #TheDeepDive.
We always love hearing from you.
And as always, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of politics. We'll be back soon with